What if the Persians had conquered Greece? The sun rises over the narrow pass of Thermopylae, painting the cliffs in shades of amber and gold. The air is still, almost reverent, as if the landscape itself remembers what happened here. This sliver of land between mountain and sea, barely wide enough for a cart to pass, was once the stage for one of history's most legendary stands. 300 Spartans and their allies held this pass against an empire that stretched from the Indus to the Aegean, an empire of millions commanded by a king who called himself the King of Kings. But what if they had failed differently? What if the narrow gate had swung open? What if the ships at Salamis had been crushed beneath Persian hulls? The story we know, the one written by Greek victors and celebrated for millennia, might never have been told. In its place would be another narrative entirely, one where the greatest empire of the ancient world absorbed the fragmentary Greek cities into its vast dominion, where democracy flickered and perhaps died, where philosophy took different paths, where Rome learned from Persian cataphracts instead of Greek phalanxes. This is not fantasy, but the examination of a moment balanced on a knife's edge. History pivots on such moments, battles decided by weather, by chance, by a single commander's choice. The Persian Wars were not inevitable Greek victories. They were desperate, improbable defenses against overwhelming odds. 3 times the tides of war could have turned, and if they had, the world you live in would be unrecognizable. Tonight, we stand at that crossroads. We watch as the Persian army, vast beyond comprehension, marches toward the Greek peninsula. We see the Greek city-states, fractious and quarrelsome, somehow uniting against common threat. And we ask the question that echoes through time. What if the Persians had won? The question is not trivial. Some historians argue that the Persian victory would have ended Western civilization before it truly began. Others suggest the outcome would have been far more complex, that Greek culture might have flourished under the tolerant Persian system, that democracy might have spread faster, that the brutal Peloponnesian War might never have devastated Greece. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in the labyrinth of possibility. To understand what might have been, we must first understand what was. We must know the Persian Empire not through Greek eyes, which saw them as barbarian despots, but as they truly were. We must walk the royal road from Susa to Sardis, understand the satrapy system that governed millions, comprehend the remarkable tolerance that allowed Jews to rebuild their temple and Babylonians to worship Marduk. We must see Persia not as the villain of a Greek epic, but as one of history's most sophisticated civilizations. And we must understand the Greeks, not as the unified heroes of legend, but as they were. Contentious city-states that spent more time fighting each other than uniting. Democratic Athens and militaristic Sparta, wealthy Corinth and isolated Thebes. The miracle was not that they defeated Persia, but that they stood together long enough to try. The battles themselves, Marathon and Thermopylae, Artemisium and Salamis, Plataea and Mycale, were not foregone conclusions but desperate gambles. Each could have ended differently. Each was a thread that, if snapped, would have unraveled the tapestry of Western history as we know it. So let us begin this journey into what might have been. Let us watch as Persian and Greek armies collide, as strategies unfold, as fates are decided, and then let us follow the thread of the alternate path. See where it leads, what world it creates. The night is long, the story is vast, and the implications stretch across millennia to touch the very world you inhabit today. The desert stars shine over Persepolis, and the Aegean moon rises over Athens. 2 worlds about to collide, 2 possible futures waiting to be born. The Persian Colossus. To understand what Persian victory would have meant, we must first shed the prejudices that have clouded our view of the Achaemenid Empire for centuries. The Persians, as portrayed in Greek sources and echoed in our own popular culture, were barbaric despots, slaves to an oriental tyrant, faceless hordes throwing themselves against the brave defenders of freedom. This is caricature, not history. The truth is far more interesting. The Persian Empire that threatened Greece in the 5th century BCE was the largest, most sophisticated political entity the world had yet seen. At its height under Darius the Great, it ruled over 44% of the world's population, stretching from the Indus Valley to the borders of Egypt, from the steppes of Central Asia to the Aegean Sea. More than 2 million square miles lay under Persian administration, encompassing dozens of peoples, languages, religions, and cultures. To call such an empire barbaric is to misunderstand the very nature of its achievement. The story begins with Cyrus the Great, who in 550 BCE overthrew his Median overlords and began building an empire that would last for 2 centuries. Cyrus was no mere conqueror. He was a visionary statesman who understood that ruling diverse peoples required not terror, but tolerance, not destruction, but integration. When he conquered Babylon, he did not destroy its temples or enslave its people. Instead, he presented himself as the chosen of Marduk, the rightful successor to the Babylonian kings. The famous Cyrus cylinder, a clay foundation inscription discovered in 1879, records these policies. Though modern interpreters have sometimes called it the first Declaration of Human Rights, scholars now recognize it was primarily a building inscription in the Babylonian tradition. Nevertheless, its message was significant for its time. Let each people worship their own gods, follow their own customs, speak their own languages. This was revolutionary. Previous empires had ruled through fear and forced assimilation. The Assyrians had been masters of terror, deporting entire populations, destroying cities as examples. The Neo-Babylonians had dragged the Jews into exile, razed Jerusalem, left its temple in ruins. Cyrus freed those Jews, gave them money to rebuild their temple, and earned their eternal gratitude. The Old Testament calls him the Lord's Anointed, a Messiah in the Jewish tradition. No other foreign ruler is honored so highly in Jewish scripture. But tolerance alone does not build an empire. Cyrus and his successors created a governmental system of remarkable sophistication. The empire was divided into provinces called satrapies, each governed by a satrap who acted as the king's viceroy. These were not petty officials, but powerful administrators, often members of the Persian nobility or conquered royal families. They collected taxes, dispensed justice, maintained roads, and commanded local forces. Under Cyrus, there were 26 satrapies. Darius the Great, recognizing that expansion required better administration, increased the number to 36. Yet the satraps were not independent rulers. Darius understood the danger of giving too much power to provincial governors. He instituted a system of checks and balances that would have impressed James Madison. In each satrapy, the military commander reported directly to the king, not to the satrap. A royal secretary assisted the satrap, but also reported independently to Persepolis. A royal treasurer controlled finances and could approve or deny the satrap's spending. Most importantly, the eyes and ears of the king traveled the empire unannounced, inspecting provinces, ensuring the king's laws were followed, checking for corruption or disloyalty. The system worked. During Cyrus's reign, there were no recorded revolts. The peoples of the empire called him father, a title of respect almost unheard of for a conqueror. When rebellions did occur later, they were usually led by ambitious satraps seeking more power, not by conquered peoples seeking freedom. The infrastructure that bound this empire together was equally impressive. Darius constructed the Royal Road, a highway stretching 1,600 miles from Susa to Sardis, with way stations every 15 miles where royal couriers could change horses. A message could travel from one end of the empire to the other in a week, a feat that would not be matched in speed until the 19th century. These roads carried not just messengers but merchants, ideas, technologies. The Persian Empire was a melting pot of cultures, and its roads were the channels through which they flowed. Trade flourished under Persian rule. Darius introduced standardized coinage, the gold daric and silver siglos, which facilitated commerce across the empire's vast distances. He lowered tariffs, encouraged trade, and invested in ports and harbors. The wealth that flowed to Persepolis was staggering, but much of it was redistributed through public works. Irrigation systems, temples, fortifications. The great palace at Persepolis, with its grand staircase carved with reliefs of subject peoples bringing tribute, was not just a monument to royal power, but a statement of imperial diversity. Justice was taken seriously in the Achaemenid system. Greek sources, even those hostile to Persia, record instances of Persian kings executing corrupt judges. One famous case involves Sisamnes, a royal judge who accepted a bribe. Cambyses too had him executed and his skin made into leather, which was then used to cover the judge's seat, a grim reminder to his successor of the price of corruption. The Persians believed that justice must be consistent across the empire, that a subject should be able to appeal to higher authorities, ultimately to the king himself, if they felt wronged. Religious tolerance extended beyond mere policy. It was woven into the fabric of Persian governance. In Egypt, Darius commissioned the codification of Egyptian law, respecting local legal traditions. Persian kings took titles appropriate to each region. They were pharaohs in Egypt, kings of Babylon in Mesopotamia, champions of Ahura Mazda in Persia proper. This was not cynicism, but a sophisticated understanding that legitimacy requires respecting local beliefs. Yet this empire, for all its sophistication, had an ambition that would prove its undoing. The Greeks, those fractious cities on the empire's western fringe, would not submit. The Persian desire to punish Athens for supporting the Ionian revolt and to secure the empire's European borders would lead to the great invasions. But was this ambition unreasonable? From the Persian perspective, the Greeks were troublemakers on their frontier, supporting rebels, threatening stability. The campaign to subdue them was not imperialism for its own sake, but the logical extension of securing the empire's borders. Understanding this Persian perspective is crucial. When we imagine Persian victory, we are not imagining the triumph of barbarism over civilization. We are imagining a world where the most advanced administrative system of the ancient world absorbed the brilliant but chaotic Greek cities. What would have resulted is not obvious. It might have been catastrophe. It might have been synthesis. The answer lies in how the Persians actually ruled, and in what the Greeks might have become under that rule. As we turn to the wars themselves, remember this. The Persians were not monsters. They were empire builders, sophisticated, tolerant by the standards of their time, capable of both great cruelty and remarkable mercy. The question of what would have happened had they conquered Greece is not a simple matter of darkness overcoming light. It is far more complex and far more interesting than that. The clash begins. Ionian revolt to Marathon. The Persian Wars did not begin with Darius's invasion of Greece proper. They began across the Aegean, in the Greek cities of Ionia, that coastal strip of Asia Minor where Greek culture had flourished for centuries under first Lydian and then Persian rule. These cities, prosperous trading centers like Miletus and Ephesus, had initially submitted to Persian authority without much resistance, but by 499 BCE resentment had grown. The Persians had installed or supported tyrants in these cities, autocratic rulers who governed on behalf of the empire. For Greeks accustomed to more participatory forms of government, this was galling. The revolt, when it came, was not simply about freedom versus tyranny. It was about trade routes, about local rivalries, about personal ambitions. Aristagoras, the tyrant of Miletus, found himself in financial difficulty after a failed expedition against the island of Naxos. Fearing Persian punishment, he made a desperate gamble. He resigned his tyranny, proclaimed democracy, and called upon the Ionian cities to revolt. It was a calculated move, transforming personal failure into ideological resistance. The rebels knew they could not stand alone. They sent envoys across the Aegean to mainland Greece, seeking aid. Most Greek cities refused. Sparta, the greatest military power in Greece, declined to send help. But Athens, flush with democratic fervor and harboring old grievances against Persia, voted to send 20 ships. The nearby city of Eretria sent 5 more. It was not a massive commitment, but it would prove fateful. The Athenian ships arrived in Ionia, joined the rebel forces, and marched inland. Together, Greek and Ionian forces captured and burned Sardis, the capital of the Persian satrapy of Lydia. It was a shocking blow to Persian prestige. Sardis was not just any city, but the western hub of Persian power, the terminus of the royal road. The flames that consumed it could be seen from miles away. The rebels rejoiced, but they had unleashed something they could not control. Darius the Great, when he learned of Sardis's burning, was reportedly so angry that he had a servant remind him 3 times each day. "Master, remember the Athenians." It was not mere vengeance, but a matter of principle. The Athenians had interfered in Persian internal affairs, supported rebels, attacked imperial territory. They had to be punished, or every other subject people would think rebellion worth attempting. The Ionian revolt dragged on for 6 years. The Persians, initially caught off guard, methodically reconquered city after city. At the Battle of Lade in 494 BCE, the Persian fleet crushed the Ionian navy. Miletus fell shortly after and was razed, its population killed or enslaved. The revolt was over, and with it died the last serious resistance to Persian rule in Asia Minor. But Darius had not forgotten Athens. In 492 BCE, he sent his son-in-law Mardonius with an army and fleet to subjugate Greece. The expedition was partly successful. Mardonius conquered Thrace and forced Macedonia into vassalage. But then disaster struck. A storm off Mount Athos destroyed much of the Persian fleet, and the expedition returned home. The Greeks had been granted a reprieve, but not for long. In 490 BCE, Darius tried again. This time he sent a naval expedition directly across the Aegean, commanded by Datis and Artaphernes. The fleet carried perhaps 25,000 men, a relatively modest force by Persian standards, but still formidable. The strategy was clear: sail directly to Athens, subdue it, then return. It was meant to be a punitive expedition, not a full-scale invasion. The Persian fleet first subdued the Cycladic islands, then sailed to Euboea and laid siege to Eretria. After a few days, the city fell through treachery, and its population was enslaved. The fleet then crossed the narrow strait to the Attic coast and landed at Marathon, a plain northeast of Athens. The location was not accidental. It was the estate of Hippias, the former tyrant of Athens who had been expelled 2 decades earlier, and now accompanied the Persian expedition, hoping to be reinstalled as a puppet ruler. The Athenians faced a terrible choice. They could abandon their city and flee, or they could march out to meet the Persians. They chose to fight. The Athenian army, perhaps 10,000 hoplites strong, marched to Marathon. They were joined by a small contingent from Plataea, loyal allies who had sent their entire force, all 1,000 of them. The Spartans had been asked for help, but replied that religious festivals prevented them from marching immediately. They would come, they promised, but only after the full moon. In ancient Greece, the sacred and the strategic often conflicted. At Marathon, the two armies faced each other across the plain. For days they waited, neither side willing to make the first move. The Persians were content to delay, perhaps hoping for Athenian resolve to crack, or for treachery within the city. The Athenians were waiting for Spartan reinforcements. But time was working against the Greeks. The longer they stayed at Marathon, the more exposed Athens became. Then something changed. Ancient sources differ on what exactly triggered the battle, but the most likely explanation involves Persian cavalry. The Persians had horses, the Greeks did not. Persian horsemen could ride around the Greek flanks, attack from behind, turn their heavy infantry formation into chaos. But for reasons still debated, the Persian cavalry was not present on the day of battle. Perhaps they had been sent by ship to try landing directly at Athens. Perhaps they were simply watering their horses elsewhere. Whatever the reason, their absence was noticed by the Greeks. The Athenian commander, Miltiades, understood this was his moment. The Persian cavalry would return eventually, but right now, the Persian infantry stood alone. He gave the order to attack. The Greek phalanx, that tight formation of overlapping shields and protruding spears, charged across the plain. The Athenians had deliberately weakened their center and strengthened their wings, a risky maneuver that required perfect discipline. When the armies collided, the Persian center, composed of their best troops, pushed the Greek center back. For a moment it seemed the Greeks would break, but the Greek wings, stronger and deeper, crushed the Persian flanks and then wheeled inward, enveloping the Persian center. What followed was slaughter. The Persians, trapped, panicked. They fled toward their ships, the Greeks pursuing. Ancient accounts claim 6,400 Persians died, to only 192 Athenians. These numbers are likely exaggerated, but the scale of the victory was real. The Persian expedition retreated, sailing away from Marathon with their wounded pride and their decimated force. Athens erupted in celebration. They had done the impossible, defeated the army of the King of Kings in open battle. Legend tells of a runner named Phidippides who had earlier run to Sparta seeking aid, covering some 150 miles in just 2 days. After the victory at Marathon, according to later traditions, another runner carried news of the victory to Athens, though who he was and what exactly happened remains shrouded in myth. This legendary run, in various forms, would inspire the modern marathon race. The sacrifice seemed fitting for such a momentous triumph. But in Persia, the defeat barely registered. 6,000 soldiers lost from an empire of millions. It was embarrassing, not catastrophic. Darius immediately began preparing a much larger invasion. This time, there would be no naval expedition, but a full-scale land and sea campaign that would overwhelm Greece completely. He would cross the Hellespont with an army so vast that the Greeks would have no choice but to submit. Death intervened. In 486 BCE, Darius died while preparing for this invasion, his vengeance on Athens unfulfilled. But his son Xerxes inherited both the throne and the ambition. For 4 years Xerxes prepared. He gathered an army from every corner of the empire. He commissioned a bridge of boats across the Hellespont and cut a canal through the Mount Athos Peninsula to avoid the storm-prone waters that had destroyed Mardonius's fleet. When he finally marched in 480 BCE, it was with a force unlike any the world had seen. Marathon had proven that the Persians could be beaten, but it had also convinced the Persians that a much larger, more overwhelming force was necessary. The next invasion would not be a raid but a conquest, and the Greeks, exultant in their victory, would face a test that made Marathon look like a skirmish. The stage was set for the great confrontation. Thermopylae, Athens, Salamis, Plataea, the names that would define Western history, but each was a near-run thing. Each could have ended differently, and if they had, the world would be unrecognizable. Xerxes' grand invasion spring came to Persia in 480 BCE, and with it came the thunder of the greatest army ever assembled. Xerxes, king of kings, ruler of an empire that stretched from sunrise to sunset, was finally ready. His father Darius had been humiliated at Marathon, had died before he could take revenge. Now Xerxes would complete what his father had begun. He would not merely punish Athens, he would subjugate all of Greece, bind it permanently to the Persian Empire, remove this irritating thorn from his western frontier once and for all. The numbers recorded by Herodotus are fantastical. 1,700,000 soldiers, he claimed, plus 80,000 cavalry. The fleet numbered 1,207 warships. The baggage train, the camp followers, the servants were so numerous that rivers ran dry where they stopped to drink. Modern historians reject these figures as impossible. No ancient state could have fielded, supplied, or commanded such numbers, but even conservative estimates suggest a force of perhaps 150,000 to 300,000 men, with a fleet of 600 to 800 ships. By ancient standards, this was staggering. The Greeks could field perhaps 70,000 hoplites from all their city-states combined, and only a fraction of those would actually answer the call. Xerxes' preparations had been meticulous. The bridge across the Hellespont, that narrow strait between Asia and Europe, was an engineering marvel. Hundreds of ships were lashed together, forming a pontoon bridge wide enough for an army to cross. When storms destroyed the first bridge, Xerxes reportedly ordered the sea whipped and branded with hot irons, a gesture of such hubristic absurdity that it became legend. But the second bridge held, and the army crossed from Asia to Europe. The canal through Mount Athos, cut to avoid the storms that had destroyed Mardonius's fleet, was equally impressive. Persian engineers carved a channel wide enough for 2 triremes to pass through, a massive undertaking that took years. Critics at the time suggested this was unnecessary, that ships could simply be dragged across the narrow isthmus. But Xerxes wanted no repeat of earlier disasters. Every precaution was taken. The army that marched through Thrace and Macedonia was a polyglot host representing the diversity of the Persian Empire. There were Persians in their distinctive fish-scale armor and felt tiaras, Medes with leather caps and wicker shields, Babylonians with bronze helmets, Indians in cotton clothing carrying reed bows, Ethiopians in lion and leopard skins, Arabians with long flowing robes. Each contingent brought its own weapons, its own tactics, its own commanders. The coordination required to move such a force was extraordinary. The Greeks, when word of the invasion reached them, were terrified. A congress of Greek city-states met at the Isthmus of Corinth to coordinate defense. But unity was elusive. Many northern Greek cities submitted to Xerxes without resistance, sending the traditional tokens of submission: earth and water. Thessaly, powerful but vulnerable, made peace with Persia. Thebes would famously side with the invaders. Of the hundreds of Greek city-states, only about 70 joined the defensive alliance. The rest either collaborated, stayed neutral, or were conquered. The Greek strategy was born of desperation and geography. Greece's mountainous terrain offered natural defensive positions. If the Persians could be delayed, if their massive army could be forced into narrow places where numbers meant nothing, perhaps the Greeks could hold. The first such place was the Vale of Tempe in northern Thessaly, but scouts reported it could be bypassed. The Greeks abandoned it without a fight. The second defensive position was Thermopylae, the Hot Gates, a narrow pass between mountain and sea, where the coastal road from northern to central Greece squeezed through. At its narrowest point, the pass was only 15 meters wide. Here, the Persian army could not bring its numbers to bear. A small force of hoplites, with their long spears and overlapping shields, could hold the pass indefinitely. Sparta sent its king, Leonidas, with his personal bodyguard of 300 Spartiate warriors. the elite of the elite. Other cities contributed more. Perhaps 7,000 hoplites in total held the pass. It was a token force, a sacrifice to buy time. The real Greek strategy lay not on land, but at sea. At the same time as Thermopylae, the Greek navy gathered at Artemisium, a cape near the northern tip of Euboea. Here, the Persian fleet would have to pass through narrow waters to reach southern Greece. If the Greeks could hold at Artemisium and Thermopylae simultaneously, they could prevent the Persians from using their naval superiority to land troops behind the Greek positions. It was a two-pronged defense, and both parts had to hold for it to work. The Athenians had spent the decades since Marathon preparing for this moment. Themistocles, the brilliant and controversial Athenian statesman, had convinced Athens to use silver from newly discovered mines not for public distributions, but to build ships. 200 triremes, sleek warships powered by 3 banks of oars and armed with bronze rams, now formed the core of the Greek fleet. These ships were Athens' bet on the future, and they would prove decisive. Xerxes' army reached Thermopylae in late summer, 480 BCE. For 3 days, Leonidas and his men held the pass. The Persians sent wave after wave of troops, but in the narrow space, they could not overwhelm the Greek position. The hoplites, fighting in close formation, used their longer spears to deadly effect. The Persians, with shorter weapons and lighter armor, could not close with their enemies without being cut down. Even the Immortals, Xerxes' elite bodyguard of 10,000, could not break through. Then came betrayal. A local Greek named Ephialtes approached Xerxes and offered to show the Persians a mountain path that led around Thermopylae, emerging behind the Greek position. Xerxes sent the Immortals along this path at night. They encountered a small Greek force guarding the trail, defeated them, and descended toward the Greek camp from behind. When Leonidas learned of this, he dismissed most of his force. There was no point in them all dying, but he and his 300 Spartans, along with 700 Thespians and 400 Thebans, remained to hold the pass as long as possible, buying time for the rest of the Greek army to retreat. The final stand was heroic and futile. Surrounded and overwhelmed, the Greeks fought to the last man. Leonidas fell early, and the battle became a struggle over his body. When the fighting ended, the Persians had won, but at a cost that surprised them. At Artemisium, the naval battle raged for 3 days, simultaneously with Thermopylae. The Greeks, outnumbered but fighting in waters they knew well, held their own. They inflicted serious damage on the Persian fleet, though they suffered heavily themselves. When news came of Leonidas's defeat, the Greek fleet withdrew. There was no point holding Artemisium if Thermopylae had fallen. The road to Athens lay open. Xerxes marched south through Boeotia, accepting the surrender of Thebes and other cities. The Athenians, on Themistocles' advice, evacuated their city. Women, children, and the elderly were sent to Troezen and Salamis. The men joined the fleet. When the Persians entered Athens, they found it nearly empty. They burned the Acropolis, destroyed the temples, and completed Darius's revenge. But the victory was hollow. The Athenian people were not defeated, only displaced. The rest of Greece retreated to the Isthmus of Corinth, where they began building a wall across the narrow neck of land. Behind that wall lay the Peloponnese, including Sparta. If the isthmus could be held, the heartland of Greece would remain free. But the Persian fleet could sail around, land troops behind the wall, make the position untenable. The war would be decided not on land, but at sea. Xerxes had won every battle so far. Thermopylae had fallen, Athens had burned. Yet he had not won the war. The Greek fleet remained intact. The Greek army was still in the field, and time was against him. The campaigning season was ending. Soon storms would make naval operations impossible, and feeding his massive army would become difficult. He needed a decisive victory, and he needed it soon. The Greeks, battered but not broken, gathered their fleet at Salamis, an island just off the coast of Attica. Here, in the narrow straits between island and mainland, they would make their stand. Themistocles, manipulating both his Greek allies and Persian intelligence, engineered the confrontation he knew was Greece's only hope. The Battle of Salamis would decide everything. Salamis, the turning point. The Straits of Salamis, in late September 480 BCE, were crowded with Greek ships, 366 triremes and 7 pentaconters. The entire surviving naval strength of the alliance lay at anchor in the narrow waters. The sailors and marines could see Athens burning across the bay, see the smoke rising from the Acropolis where Persian soldiers had destroyed the sacred temples. The sight hardened their resolve. But it also raised doubts. Many Greek commanders, particularly those from the Peloponnese, wanted to retreat. Why risk the fleet here when they could fall back to the Isthmus of Corinth, support the defensive wall, fight closer to their homes? Themistocles understood what the others did not. The war would not be won at the Isthmus. If the Persian fleet remained intact, it could simply sail around, land troops behind the wall, turn the Greek defensive position into a trap. The only way to save Greece was to destroy or cripple the Persian navy. And the only place that could happen was here, in these narrow waters, where Greek maneuverability and skill could offset Persian numbers. But his fellow commanders were skeptical. Eurybiades, the Spartan admiral who nominally commanded the allied fleet, leaned toward retreat. Themistocles needed to force the issue, to make retreat impossible, to engineer a battle on his terms. What he did next was either brilliant or reckless, perhaps both. He sent a trusted slave, Sisinus, to the Persian camp with a message for Xerxes. The message claimed Themistocles was secretly sympathetic to Persia and warned that the Greeks were planning to escape during the night. If Xerxes wanted to trap them, he should move his fleet to block the exits from Salamis immediately. Whether Xerxes believed the message or simply saw an opportunity, he acted on it. During the night, Persian ships moved into position at both ends of the strait, effectively surrounding the Greek fleet. By morning, when the Greek commanders learned what had happened, retreat was no longer possible. Themistocles had gotten his battle. The numbers favored Persia significantly. Even after losses at Artemisium and from storms, the Persian fleet likely numbered between 600 and 800 warships. Against 370 Greek ships, the advantage was overwhelming. But numbers can be a liability in confined waters. The strait at Salamis was perhaps 1 to 1.5 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, not enough room for hundreds of ships to maneuver freely. The battle began in confusion. The Persians, confident in their superiority, advanced into the strait in several columns, but they immediately encountered problems. The confined space prevented them from using their superior numbers to envelop the Greek line. Ships collided with each other, oars tangled, the formation broke apart. The Greeks, by contrast, maintained tight formation, their crews working in perfect coordination, the product of months of practice. The Greek ships struck with devastating effect. The trireme's primary weapon was its bronze ram, a pointed projection extending from the bow at the waterline. Rowed at speed, a trireme could punch through the hull of an enemy ship, flooding it and sinking it in minutes. But this required precision, timing, and space to maneuver. In the chaos of Salamis, the Greeks had all three. The Persians, trying to maintain formation in crowded waters, had none. The Athenian contingent, led by Themistocles, engaged the Persian right wing. The Aeginetan and Megarian ships struck the center. The Spartans and Corinthians, whose ships carried the best-trained marines, closed for boarding actions where Greek hoplites proved superior to Persian infantry. Across the strait, individual battles raged, each a desperate struggle of ramming and boarding. Archery and spearwork. From his throne set on a hillside overlooking the strait, Xerxes watched his fleet disintegrate. The Persian ships, unable to coordinate in the confined space, became victims of Greek skill and desperation. Some Persian ships, trying to retreat, collided with those still advancing. Others, damaged and sinking, became obstacles. The more ships the Persians committed to the battle, the worse the congestion became. By afternoon, the Persian fleet was in full retreat. The Greeks pursued, inflicting further damage, but exhaustion and caution eventually slowed the chase. When the tally was made, perhaps 200 Persian ships had been sunk or captured, to only 40 Greek losses. More importantly, Persian morale was shattered. They had expected easy victory, and instead suffered humiliating defeat. Xerxes faced a terrible decision. His fleet was badly damaged, his prestige wounded. Winter was approaching, making naval operations increasingly dangerous. The army could probably still break through at the isthmus, but without naval support, supply would be difficult. And there was a darker fear. If he remained in Greece, the Greeks might send their fleet to the Hellespont and destroy the pontoon bridge, trapping him in Europe while rebellions erupted in Asia. He chose to retreat, leaving behind a picked force of perhaps 80,000 men under his general Mardonius. Xerxes returned to Persia with the bulk of the army and what remained of the fleet. Ancient sources claim the retreat was disastrous, that thousands died of starvation and disease on the long march back. But Xerxes and his core forces made it home. The campaign had failed, but the empire remained intact. Mardonius wintered in Thessaly and Boeotia, areas firmly under Persian control. He attempted diplomacy, offering Athens generous terms if they would change sides: restoration of their city, territorial expansion, alliance rather than subjugation. Athens, to its credit, refused. The war would continue. The following summer, 479 BCE, brought the final act. Mardonius marched south again, occupying Athens a second time, but he could not bring the Greeks to battle on terms favourable to him. Finally, the Greek army, now numbering perhaps 50,000 hoplites and nearly as many light troops, marched to meet him near the city of Plataea. The Battle of Plataea was the largest land battle of the Persian Wars. For days the armies skirmished, each trying to gain advantage. Then Persian cavalry attacks disrupted Greek supply lines and fouled their water sources. The Greeks began to retreat during the night, but the movement became disorganized. Mardonius, seeing the confusion, ordered a general assault. What should have been a Persian victory turned into disaster. The Spartans and Tegeans, fighting as a separate unit, formed defensive formation and held against repeated Persian attacks. When Mardonius himself fell in the fighting, Persian morale collapsed. The army broke and fled to their fortified camp. The Greeks stormed the camp, and what followed was massacre. Thousands of Persians died, including most of the Persian high command. On the same day, according to legend, the Greeks won another victory at Mycale on the Ionian coast, destroying the remainder of the Persian fleet. Whether the timing was coincidence or the Greeks used it for propaganda, the effect was the same. Persian power in the Aegean was broken. The Persian Wars were over. Greece had survived, and more than survived, had proven itself capable of defeating the greatest empire on earth. The psychological impact was enormous. The Greeks had not just won battles, but validated their way of life, their political systems, their culture. The victory would fuel a golden age of art, philosophy, and literature. It would inspire confidence that would eventually lead to Alexander's conquest of Persia itself. But it had been close, so terribly close. If Themistocles had not engineered the battle at Salamis, if the winds had been different, if a single Greek captain had broken formation at a critical moment, the outcome could have been reversed. And if it had, everything would have changed. The fork in the road, what if Persia won? History pivots on moments, and the Persian Wars offered several. Let us examine the critical junctures where different choices or different luck could have led to Persian victory. Each represents a fork in the road, a point where our timeline diverged from others that might have been. The first decisive moment was Marathon in 490 BCE. The Persian force that landed there was not overwhelming by Persian standards, perhaps 25,000 men, but it was formidable by Greek standards. The Athenians fielded 10,000 hoplites, reinforced by 1,000 Plataeans. The Spartans were absent, held back by religious observances. Based on what we know of ancient warfare, if the Persian cavalry had been present during the battle, the outcome could have been very different. We can imagine the Persian horsemen flanking the Greek phalanx, attacking from behind, creating panic. The Greek formation, so effective in frontal combat, was vulnerable to rear attacks. Once broken, the hoplites would likely have been slaughtered. Athens itself, only 26 miles away, would probably have fallen within days. The democratic government would have been overthrown. Hippias reinstalled as tyrant, the city made a Persian client state. This alternate marathon would have fundamentally altered the next decade. Without the confidence born of that victory, evidence suggests Athens would not have built its great fleet. Themistocles would remain a minor politician, not a savior. When Xerxes invaded in 480 BCE, he would have faced a divided, demoralized Greece with Athens already under Persian control. The defense of Thermopylae might still have happened, but without Athenian ships, the naval battle at Artemisium would have been impossible. The Greek fleet simply would not have existed in the form that it did. The second critical moment was Salamis itself. The battle was not foreordained Greek victory. If Xerxes had not taken Themistocles' bait, if the Persian fleet had instead blockaded Salamis without entering the strait, the strategic situation would have been dire for the Greeks. Supplies would have run out. Divisions among Greek commanders would have intensified. Within weeks, perhaps days, the Greek fleet would have had to either fight its way out piecemeal or surrender, or consider how the battle might have unfolded differently. Suppose the Persians had waited for wind conditions that favored their Phoenician crews, masters of Mediterranean sailing. Suppose they had coordinated better, committed fewer ships initially, maintained formation. The strait at Salamis was constraining, but not impossibly narrow. A more careful Persian approach could have ground down the Greek fleet through sheer attrition. With the Greek fleet destroyed or scattered, the war would have been effectively over. The wall at the Isthmus of Corinth could not be held without naval support. Persian ships could land troops anywhere along the Peloponnesian coast. Sparta, powerful but isolated, would have been forced to negotiate or face invasion. Historical precedent suggests they would have negotiated, seeking the best terms possible. The third critical moment was the decision of Greek city-states to resist at all. Many did not. Thebes sided with Persia. Argos remained neutral. If Athens, influenced by a different faction, had accepted Persia's generous peace terms after Salamis, the war would have ended there. And Athens, allied with Persia, could have convinced other cities that resistance was futile. The unity that made Greek victory possible was fragile, maintained only through extraordinary leadership and shared desperation. So let us imagine that one or more of these moments turned differently. The Persians win Marathon, or Salamis, or simply outlast Greek unity. By 479 BCE, all of Greece is under Persian control. Based on historical patterns of Persian administration, we can infer what might have followed. The immediate consequences are fairly straightforward based on Persian practices elsewhere. Mainland Greece would likely become a collection of satrapies within the Persian Empire. Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Thebes. They would continue to exist as cities, but their foreign policy would be dictated by the great king. They would pay tribute, contribute troops for Persian campaigns, accept Persian oversight of their governments. Drawing from patterns observed in other conquered territories, we can reasonably assume that some Greek leaders would resist and be executed or exiled. Others would collaborate and be rewarded with power and wealth. The pattern was established in Ionia, where Persian conquest was followed by executions of resistance leaders and elevation of cooperative aristocrats. Greece proper would likely follow the same pattern. The Persian approach, as we have seen in their actual historical governance, was generally tolerant of local customs and governance. This was not altruism but pragmatism. Forcing cultural conformity on diverse peoples was expensive and counterproductive. It was easier to let them keep their laws, their languages, their gods, so long as they paid taxes and stayed loyal. But Greek political life would change fundamentally. The extreme form of democracy that developed in Athens after the Persian Wars would be impossible under Persian oversight. Democracies were acceptable to Persia. They had even established them in Ionia after the revolt proved that supporting tyrants backfired. But radical democracy, where the assembly of citizens made all major decisions including foreign policy, would not be tolerated. Foreign policy belonged to the great king alone. More likely, Greece would see the development of moderate oligarchies or limited democracies, where wealthier citizens held power and maintained connections to the satrapal administration. This was the pattern in other parts of the empire, and it generally worked well. Local elites were given a stake in the system, maintaining order and collecting taxes in exchange for power and profit. The cultural implications are harder to predict. Would Greek art, literature, and philosophy still flourish under Persian rule? Or would the unique conditions that produced the Athenian Golden Age be destroyed by conquest? This question leads us deeper into what Greek culture was and what Persian rule meant in practice. The answer is neither as simple as freedom produces genius nor conquest destroys culture. The reality was always more complex, more interesting than our myths suggest. To understand what Greek culture under Persian rule might have been, we must look at what actually happened in the parts of the Greek world that the Persians did control. And that story offers some surprises. Greek culture. Under the Persian shadow, when we imagine Persian conquest of Greece, we often imagine cultural destruction. Temples burned, libraries destroyed, philosophers silenced, democracy extinguished. This is partly because we rely on Greek sources, which portrayed Persians as barbaric, despite their own contemporaneous evidence contradicting that portrayal. But partly it is because we want history to be simple. Freedom versus tyranny, West versus East, civilization versus barbarism. The reality of Persian rule over Greek populations was far more nuanced. The best evidence for what Persian rule of Greece might have been like comes from Ionia, the Greek-speaking cities of Western Asia Minor that were under Persian control before, during, and after the Persian Wars. These were not peripheral Greek settlements, but major centers of Greek culture. Miletus was the birthplace of philosophy, where Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes pioneered rational inquiry into nature. Ephesus was home to Heraclitus, whose enigmatic fragments influenced all subsequent Greek thought. Samos produced Pythagoras. These were not backwaters, but the intellectual vanguard of the Greek world. Under Persian rule, these cities continued to thrive culturally. Philosophy did not cease with conquest. Science, mathematics, and literary arts continued. Hecataeus of Miletus, writing under Persian rule, produced geographical and historical works that influenced Herodotus. The Ionian cities remained wealthy, their trade routes accessing the vast Persian market, their merchants enriched by imperial commerce. Yes, the Persians initially supported tyrants in these cities, local strongmen who ruled on Persia's behalf. But when this policy provoked the Ionian revolt in 499 BCE, the Persians adapted. After crushing the rebellion, they could have imposed harsher rule, made examples of the cities. Instead, the Persian general Mardonius did something remarkable. He abolished the tyrannies and established democracies in the Ionian cities. Herodotus, no friend of Persia, records this fact clearly. This was not ideological commitment to democracy, but pragmatic recognition that Greeks resented tyranny and would rebel against it. If democracies would keep them peaceful and paying taxes, then let them have democracies. The Persian system was flexible enough to accommodate different forms of local government, so long as the essential requirements were met. Tribute paid, troops supplied when needed. No foreign policy independence. This pattern suggests how Persian rule of mainland Greece might have worked. Athens could have kept a democratic government, probably with some restrictions on radical measures. The assembly would control local affairs, but not foreign policy. The Areopagus, the council of former archons, would likely be strengthened as an interface with Persian authority. Wealthy Athenians with connections to the satrapal administration would gain influence. Sparta presents a different case. The militaristic, oligarchic Spartan system, with its kings and ephors, its rigid social hierarchy, its system of helot serfdom was so different from typical Greek governance that it might have been left largely intact. Persia had no objection to monarchy or aristocracy. What they would not tolerate was Spartan foreign adventures or leadership of anti-Persian movements. A Sparta focused inward, maintaining control over the helots, would be acceptable. Cultural production in this alternate Greece would face different constraints and opportunities. The great dramatists, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, would they still write if Persia ruled? Possibly. Greek theatre was religious festival, entertainment, civic ritual. The Persians generally did not interfere with religious practices. The plays might avoid open political commentary on Persian affairs, but Greek tragedy was typically set in mythical past, allowing metaphorical treatment of contemporary issues. Philosophy might thrive even more than in our timeline. One of the great ironies is that Athens's golden age of philosophy occurred after the city had lost much of its real power, during and after the Peloponnesian War, when it was caught between Sparta and Persia. Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle lived in a declining Athens that had lost its empire and much of its independence. Their philosophical questioning arose partly from the crisis of Athenian identity. And Athens, under Persian rule, might have experienced similar questioning, similar philosophical exploration of justice, virtue, and the good life. In fact, Persian rule might have prevented some disasters. The Peloponnesian War, that devastating conflict between Athens and Sparta, from 431 to 404 BCE, would not have happened if both were Persian subjects. That war killed tens of thousands, destroyed cities, bankrupted treasuries, and left Greece exhausted. Persian rule, for all its limits on freedom, would have prevented this mutual destruction. Trade would flourish under Persian rule. The royal road system, the standardized coinage, the imperial postal service, all these would connect Greek merchants to markets from Egypt to India. The economic integration of the Mediterranean with the Near East and Central Asia, which happened gradually over centuries, might have accelerated dramatically. Greek wine, olive oil, pottery and textiles would find buyers across the empire. Greek artisans and craftsmen would be in demand for Persian construction projects. The synthesis of Greek and Persian culture would begin earlier and more thoroughly than in our timeline. In our history, this synthesis happened after Alexander's conquest created the Hellenistic world. But Alexander only conquered because Greece was free to produce him. If Greece were already part of the Persian Empire, the cultural mixing would occur differently, but no less intensely. Greek art would incorporate Persian motifs, just as Achaemenid art had already incorporated Greek influences. The Persian practice of importing craftsmen from conquered territories meant that Greek artists would work on Persian palaces and temples, their styles mixing. Greek sculptors, famous for their naturalistic human figures, would meet Persian artists who excelled at stylized animal forms and geometric patterns. The result would be a distinctive Greco-Persian artistic tradition. Language would shift in interesting ways. Greek would remain dominant in Greek cities, but Aramaic, the administrative language of the Persian Empire, would be widely learned by anyone dealing with imperial bureaucracy. Bilingualism would become common among the educated classes. Eventually, Greek might have borrowed more Persian words, Persian more Greek words. A hybrid literary culture could develop, with texts circulating in both languages, ideas flowing more freely across linguistic boundaries. Religion presents a fascinating question. The Persians practiced Zoroastrianism, with its dualistic theology of Ahura Mazda and Angra Mainyu, its emphasis on moral choice, its eschatology of final judgment. Greek religion was polytheistic, anthropomorphic, focused on ritual rather than doctrine. The two systems were fundamentally incompatible theologically but compatible in practice. Persians did not force their religion on subjects. Greek gods would continue to be worshipped in Greek temples, but ideas would cross-pollinate. Zoroastrian concepts of cosmic struggle between good and evil, of individual moral responsibility, of afterlife judgment might influence Greek philosophical thought. Already in our timeline, some Greek philosophers showed awareness of Persian religious ideas. Under direct Persian rule, such influence would be stronger. Greek philosophy might have developed a more explicit ethical dualism, a stronger sense of cosmic moral order. The question of democracy deserves special attention because it is central to how we view the Persian Wars. We are told the Greeks fought for freedom, specifically for democratic freedom, against Persian despotism. But this is simplification. Most Greek city-states were not democracies, and even Athens' democracy was limited. Women, slaves, and foreigners had no political rights. Sparta, the other major Greek power, was an oligarchic military state that kept most of its population in serfdom. Democracy was not strangled by Persian rule in Ionia, and it might have continued in some form in a Persian-ruled Greece. But the radical democracy that developed in Athens after the Persian Wars, where the assembly of male citizens made all major decisions, where officials were chosen by lot, where even the poorest citizen had equal say, this would not have developed. The need to coordinate with Persian authority would have required a more stable, less volatile political system. Is that a loss? Yes, absolutely. Radical democracy, for all its flaws and limitations, was an extraordinary experiment in self-governance. It produced remarkable political thought and civic engagement. But it also produced demagogues, mob justice, and disastrous foreign policy decisions. The execution of Socrates, voted by the assembly, was democracy in action. So was the ill-fated Sicilian expedition that killed thousands of Athenians in pursuit of imperial glory. A more moderate, oligarchic Athens under Persian oversight might have been more stable and less creative politically, but it might also have avoided some of democracy's worst excesses. This is not to justify conquest, only to recognize that the relationship between political systems and cultural achievement is complex. Freedom is valuable, but chaos can be destructive. Stability enables some forms of cultural production, even as it constrains others. The Greek legacy to Western civilization would be different, but not absent. Philosophy would continue, literature would flourish, art would evolve, but the specific narrative of Greece as the birthplace of democracy, the defender of freedom against Eastern despotism, would not exist. Instead, we might remember Greece as the cultural bridge between East and West, the place where Indo-European and Semitic traditions synthesized, where Persian administrative sophistication met Greek intellectual curiosity. And there is another factor to consider: the Greek colonies. When we speak of Greece, we often mean only the mainland and Aegean islands, but Greek culture existed across the Mediterranean. Southern Italy and Sicily were heavily Greek, Magna Graecia as the Romans called it. These colonies, far from Persian reach, would remain independent even if the homeland fell. They would become the keepers of Greek cultural memory, the free Hellas in exile. These Western Greeks would view their conquered cousins with a mixture of pity and superiority. They would develop their own version of Greek culture, one that defined itself against Persian domination. When Rome began its rise in Italy, it would encounter these Western Greeks and learn from them. The philosophical and cultural transmission to Rome would happen differently, but it would still happen. The butterfly effect spread from Greece like ripples in a pond. Rome, Macedonia, Carthage, Egypt, all would develop differently in a world where Persia controlled Greece. To understand how different, we must now turn our gaze westward, to Italy and the city that would become the greatest empire of the ancient world. In our timeline, Rome learned from free Greeks and eventually conquered them. What would Rome become if its first Greek teachers were subjects of Persia? The butterfly effect. Rome and the West in our timeline. Rome's relationship with Greece was foundational. The Romans conquered the Greek world, but were themselves conquered by Greek culture. Roman literature began with translations of Greek texts. Roman philosophy was largely Greek philosophy in Latin. Roman architecture borrowed Greek columns and proportions. Roman religion incorporated Greek gods with name changes. The Romans joked that captive Greece had taken her fierce captor captive. This cultural transmission happened gradually over centuries. From the earliest contacts between Rome and the Greek colonies in southern Italy, through Rome's conquest of the Greek East in the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE, continuing even as Rome ruled Greece politically. Greek tutors educated Roman children. Greek physicians tended Roman health. Greek artists decorated Roman homes. The relationship was complex. Political dominance combined with cultural inferiority. Conquest paired with admiration. But in a world where Persia conquered Greece, this relationship transforms fundamentally. The Greeks that Rome encounters are not free city-states jealous of their independence, but satrapies of a vast Eastern empire. They are not models of political organization, but cautionary tales of conquest. They are not teachers of freedom, but examples of submission. This changes everything. Rome in the 5th century BCE, when Persia was conquering Greece, was itself emerging from monarchy into republic. The legendary expulsion of the Tarquin kings happened around 509 BCE, just decades before Marathon. Early Rome was obsessed with preventing tyranny, creating a system of checks and balances, term limits, and divided power that would prevent any individual from becoming king. The Roman Republic defined itself against monarchy. In our timeline, Greek democracy provided Romans with philosophical justification for their own republican system. Thinkers like Polybius analyzed both systems, finding virtues and flaws in each. The Romans saw themselves as Greeks' political equals, even as they admired Greek cultural superiority. Both peoples had rejected tyranny for more participatory governance. In the alternate timeline, this parallel disappears. Greece is conquered, ruled by the great king through satraps. Greek democracy, to the extent it survives, does so only within limits set by Persian power. When Romans look east, they see not sister republics, but Persian subjects. The ideological kinship that would develop between Rome and Greece never forms in the same way. Instead, Rome might view Persia itself as the model civilization. Here was an empire that lasted centuries, that governed diverse peoples effectively, that maintained order across vast distances. The satrapy system, with its balance of local autonomy and central control, might seem more sophisticated than either Greek democracy or Roman republicanism. Roman aristocrats, always concerned with dignitas and gravitas, might find more in common with Persian nobles than with Greek democrats. Consider the Punic Wars, that defining conflict between Rome and Carthage that shaped Roman destiny. In our timeline, these wars happened in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, generations after Greek independence was secured. Rome fought Carthage for control of the Western Mediterranean, while Greece struggled with Macedon and the Hellenistic kingdoms to the east. The two spheres were relatively separate, but if Persia controlled Greece, Carthage might seek alliance with Persia to counter Roman expansion. Carthage already had connections throughout the Mediterranean. A Carthaginian-Persian alliance could encircle Rome, limit its expansion, perhaps crush it entirely. The Punic Wars would become part of a larger struggle between a rising Rome and an Eastern power bloc. Hannibal's invasion of Italy in 218 BCE might have had Persian support. Gold to pay his mercenaries, ships to supply his army, diplomatic pressure on Rome's allies. A Rome fighting both Hannibal and Persian-backed enemies simultaneously might not survive. The Roman Republic could fall in the 3rd century BCE, its territories absorbed into the Carthaginian sphere, or fragmented into Italian city-states under Persian suzerainty. Or imagine Rome survives but learns different lessons. Instead of seeing Carthage as an existential threat requiring total destruction, Rome might see the conflict as Romans and Carthaginians both caught between their own ambitions and Persian interests. The wars might end in negotiated settlement, both powers carving out spheres while acknowledging Persian supremacy in the east. Rome becomes a Western regional power, wealthy and sophisticated, but not the master of the Mediterranean. The most dramatic butterfly effect involves Alexander the Great. In our timeline, Alexander of Macedon conquered the Persian Empire between 334 and 323 BCE, creating the Hellenistic world. His conquests spread Greek culture from Egypt to India, founded cities, mixed populations, and set the stage for the next 3 centuries of Mediterranean history. Alexander is one of those individuals who genuinely changed history's trajectory, but Alexander could only conquer Persia because Greece was free to produce him. His father, Philip II of Macedon, had united Greece under Macedonian hegemony after the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BCE. Philip was able to do this because the Greek city-states had exhausted themselves in endless wars, because Thebes and Athens and Sparta had fought each other to stalemate, because no external power controlled them. If Persia had conquered Greece in 480 BCE, Macedonia's history would change completely. The kingdom of Macedon, far to the north, had actually submitted to Xerxes during the invasion. King Alexander I of Macedon sent earth and water, the tokens of submission, and his kingdom became a Persian ally. If Xerxes had won, based on Persian practices with client states, that relationship would have continued and likely been formalized. Macedonia would remain a Persian client state, its kings ruling at Persian pleasure. The Macedonian military reforms that made Philip's army so effective might never happen, or might happen in service of Persia. Philip II, if he even came to power, would be a satrap's vassal, not an independent king. And Alexander, that world-conquering genius, would either never be born or would spend his martial talents commanding Persian forces against rebellious Indians or nomadic Scythians. The Hellenistic age as we know it vanishes. No Alexander means no successor kingdoms, no Ptolemaic Egypt, no Seleucid Empire, no Indo-Greek kingdoms of Bactria. The synthesis of Greek and Near Eastern culture that we call Hellenism would happen differently, more gradually, under Persian rather than Macedonian auspices. Greek language would not become the lingua franca of the Eastern Mediterranean through military conquest. Instead, it might spread through trade and cultural exchange, one language among many in the Persian administrative system, rather than the dominant tongue of a conquering elite. This has profound implications for religion. Christianity emerged from Judaism in the Roman-controlled Eastern Mediterranean, spread via networks of Greek-speaking Jewish diaspora communities, and was initially recorded in Greek. The Apostle Paul wrote his letters in Greek. The Gospels were composed in Greek. Early Christian theology developed in Greek philosophical vocabulary. Christianity as we know it is inseparable from the Hellenistic cultural context. In a world without the Hellenistic age, Christianity's emergence and spread would be radically different. Judaism under Persian rule might develop differently, perhaps with less emphasis on exclusivity and more on ethical monotheism compatible with Persian Zoroastrian concepts. A messianic movement arising in this context would take different forms, spread through different networks, possibly never emerge at all, and Rome, lacking Greek cultural influence in the same form, would produce a different civilization. Latin literature might develop from Etruscan and Italian roots rather than Greek models. Roman religion would remain more animistic, less influenced by Greek anthropomorphism. Roman philosophy, if it developed at all, would perhaps draw on Celtic or Phoenician rather than Greek thought. The Roman Empire that eventually emerged would be recognizably Roman but alien to our understanding. Or perhaps Rome never becomes an empire at all. In our timeline, Rome's imperial expansion was partly justified by the language of bringing civilization to barbarians, a concept borrowed from the Greeks. Roman imperialism saw itself as continuing Alexander's mission of spreading higher culture. Without that ideological framework, without Greek precedents, Roman expansion might be more nakedly about conquest and wealth, less sustained, less successful. The Senate might also look east to Persia as a cautionary tale. The Persian Empire, old and established, would be Rome's contemporary. Roman senators, debating whether to give emergency powers to military commanders, might point to how the Persian system concentrated power in the great king and his satraps. Fear of becoming like Persia might reinforce republican institutions, or admiration of Persian longevity might encourage Romans to adopt similar systems. Geography imposes some constraints. Rome's position in Italy, Carthage's in North Africa, Persia's in Asia, these are fixed. Trade routes, mountain passes, sea lanes, the fundamental structure of Mediterranean geography doesn't change. Rome would still expand in Italy, still come into conflict with Carthage, still face the same basic strategic problems. But the cultural context, the ideological framework, the models available for emulation, all these would be different. One fascinating possibility is that a Persian-dominated Eastern Mediterranean might be more stable than in our timeline. The Hellenistic kingdoms were constantly at war, the successor states of Alexander fighting endless conflicts over territory and prestige. These wars were destructive and expensive, draining resources that might have been used for development. Persian rule, for all its limitations, provided stability. Trade flourished under the Pax Persica, if we can call it that. Cities grew wealthy. Arts and sciences advanced. This stability might allow for technological and scientific progress that in our timeline was disrupted by constant warfare. The Library of Alexandria, founded by the Ptolemies in our timeline, might still exist in some form, perhaps as a Persian-sponsored center of learning. The scientists and mathematicians of the Hellenistic age, figures like Euclid and Archimedes, might still make their discoveries, but in a different context, perhaps with more practical application under Persian patronage. The Romans, encountering this stable, prosperous, culturally rich Eastern world, might be more inclined to seek alliance than conquest. Why destroy what works? Why fight an empire that has lasted for centuries when you can trade with it, learn from it, perhaps eventually join it? Rome could become Persia's Western partner, the two empires dividing the world between them, clashing at frontiers but also trading, exchanging embassies, influencing each other's development. This arrangement might last centuries, a bipolar world of Persian East and Roman West, fundamentally different from our timeline but with its own logic and stability. The great conflicts would be frontier wars, not existential struggles. Cultural exchange would happen continuously across the boundary. Eventually, perhaps, the distinction between Persian and Roman would blur, a synthesis emerging that was neither pure Eastern nor pure Western, but truly Mediterranean. Yet we should not romanticize this alternate world. Persian rule, however tolerant, was still imperial domination. Taxes were extracted, resources redirected to the center, local aspirations subordinated to imperial interests. The Greeks under Persian rule might produce great art and literature, but they would lack the political freedom that in our timeline generated such remarkable innovation. The rough edges of democracy, its chaos and conflict, were also sources of creativity and dynamism. And Rome under Persian influence might never develop the republican institutions and legal thinking that became its greatest legacy. Roman law, with its concepts of citizenship, rights, and legal personhood, emerged from republican political struggles. A Rome that looked to Persia as a model might develop more authoritarian systems, less concern with individual rights, more emphasis on hierarchy and order. The legal traditions that underpin modern Western jurisprudence might never emerge. The question cannot be whether the alternate world would be better or worse. Such judgments are impossible across historical scales. It would be different, with its own achievements and failures, its own golden ages and dark periods. What we can say is that the world shaped by Persian victory over Greece would be fundamentally unlike our own, its entire trajectory altered by events in a narrow pass and a narrow strait in 480 BCE. The implications spread far beyond politics and culture. Let us now turn to the realms of thought, to philosophy and art, and ask what happens to human knowledge when the Greek experiment in freedom is curtailed by Persian conquest. Philosophy, art, and knowledge in an alternate Athens. The great achievement of Greek philosophy was the commitment to rational inquiry, unconstrained by religious or political authority. This was not unique to Greece, but the Greeks developed it more systematically than previous civilizations. From the pre-Socratics to Socrates, from Plato to Aristotle, Greek thinkers asked fundamental questions about reality, knowledge, ethics, and politics, and insisted on following arguments wherever they led. This intellectual freedom was connected to political circumstances. The philosophers of Athens in the 5th and 4th centuries BCE lived in a society where debate was central to political life. The assembly required rhetorical skill. The courts demanded persuasive argument. This culture of debate, where nothing was sacred and every claim required justification, created space for philosophical inquiry. Under Persian rule, this culture might still exist, but in modified form. The Persians, as we have seen, did not impose intellectual conformity on their subjects, but the lack of true political independence would affect the kinds of questions philosophers asked and the conclusions they reached. Socrates, that gadfly of Athens, made his living questioning citizens about their beliefs, exposing contradictions, pushing them toward deeper understanding or uncomfortable self-awareness. His method, recorded in Plato's dialogues, was relentlessly critical. No belief was exempt from scrutiny, not justice, not piety, not virtue itself. This critical stance eventually got him killed, convicted by the Athenian assembly of impiety and corrupting the youth. Would Socrates emerge in a Persian-controlled Athens? It's possible, given that the Persians did not generally suppress intellectual inquiry, but his questioning might take different directions. In our timeline, much of Socratic inquiry concerned political concepts: justice in the Republic, courage in the Laches, statesmanship in the statesman. These dialogues assumed that readers lived in politically autonomous communities where such questions mattered for practical governance. Under Persian rule, political philosophy might be less central, simply because the practical application would be limited. Questions about the best regime, about whether democracy or aristocracy or monarchy is superior, would be academic in the sense of being disconnected from any possibility of implementation. Instead, philosophy might focus more on ethics, on how to live a good life within circumstances one cannot control. This is actually the direction Greek philosophy took in the Hellenistic period. After the Macedonian conquest ended Greek political independence, Stoicism and Epicureanism, the dominant philosophies of that era, were largely concerned with personal ethics, with achieving tranquility and virtue, regardless of external circumstances. A Socrates born into Persian-ruled Athens might anticipate these Hellenistic concerns by centuries. His questions might focus less on political justice and more on individual virtue, less on the ideal state and more on the examined life. This would be valuable philosophy, arguably more relevant to human life than abstract political theory, but it would represent a narrowing of inquiry, a retreat from the ambitious Platonic project of designing ideal societies. Plato's Republic itself, that towering achievement of political philosophy, might never be written. The dialogue's central question, what is justice, leads to an extended thought experiment about the ideal city-state. But why design ideal cities if there is no possibility of implementing such designs? If Athens must accommodate itself to Persian power, the exercise becomes fantasy, perhaps dangerous fantasy that could be interpreted as implicit criticism of Persian rule. More likely, a Plato living under Persian authority would write different dialogues. He might focus more on the Phaedo's questions about the soul and immortality, or the Symposium's exploration of love and beauty. These are safer topics, less politically charged but no less profound. Persian censorship, if it existed at all, would be light-handed. The Persians cared about loyalty and tax collection, not about abstract philosophical debates, but self-censorship might be more significant. Philosophers, knowing certain topics were sensitive, would simply avoid them. Aristotle presents a different case. His philosophical method was more systematic and empirical than Plato's. He categorized knowledge, distinguishing ethics from politics, from physics, from logic. His biological works, based on careful observation of animals, were scientific in a recognizably modern sense. Much of Aristotle's work would be unaffected by political circumstances. One can study logic and biology under any government, but Aristotle's politics, his systematic study of actual constitutions and political systems, would be different. In our timeline, Aristotle and his students collected and analyzed 158 different constitutions from Greek city-states. This comparative analysis allowed him to theorize about the strengths and weaknesses of different systems. Under Persian rule, with Greek cities having less constitutional autonomy, this kind of comparative politics might be impossible or might focus on varieties within the Persian system, different models of satrap-city relationships. Aristotle also tutored Alexander the Great, an assignment that brought him into contact with Macedonian court politics and probably influenced Alexander's thinking about empire. Without an independent Macedonia, without Alexander's conquests, Aristotle's role would be different. He might still be a great philosopher, but his work would lack the political relevance it had in our timeline. He would be a scholar rather than an advisor to world conquerors. The evolution of philosophy after Aristotle would be accelerated. Hellenistic philosophy, as I mentioned, focused on ethics and personal tranquility. Stoicism taught that we should concern ourselves only with what is in our control, accepting fate with equanimity. Epicureanism recommended withdrawal from public life to cultivate simple pleasures and friendships. Skepticism questioned whether knowledge was possible at all. These philosophies made sense in a world where individuals had little power over political circumstances. If that world arrived earlier, if Greek political independence ended in 480 BCE rather than in the 330s BCE, these philosophies might emerge centuries earlier. A proto-Stoicism might develop in 5th century Athens, teaching accommodation to Persian rule while maintaining internal virtue. This would be valuable philosophy, but it would also represent philosophy's retreat from political engagement to private consolation. On the other hand, Persian rule might enable different philosophical developments. The Persians connected Greece to a much larger world. Persian-controlled Athens would be more exposed to Zoroastrian religious ideas, to Babylonian astronomy and mathematics, to Egyptian medicine and engineering, to Indian philosophical systems. This broader intellectual context might stimulate synthesis and innovation. Greek philosophy in our timeline was relatively isolated from non-Greek thought until quite late. Plato and Aristotle show little knowledge of Persian, Egyptian, or Indian philosophy, even though sophisticated philosophical traditions existed in those cultures. Under Persian rule, with more travel and communication across the empire, Greek thinkers might encounter alternative philosophical systems earlier. Imagine Plato encountering Zoroastrian dualism, with its cosmic struggle between good and evil. His theory of forms, with the good as the highest form, might be influenced by this. Or imagine Aristotle learning of Indian logic and metaphysics, with their sophisticated analysis of causation and negation. His own logical works might develop differently. In the realm of art, Persian influence would be profound and immediate. Greek visual art would blend with Persian traditions, creating new hybrid styles. The Persian preference for stylized animal forms, for elaborate decorative patterns, for vivid colors, would mix with Greek naturalism and mathematical proportion. The result might be extraordinary, a visual language combining the strengths of both traditions. Greek theatre might be the art form least affected by conquest, since it was rooted in religious festivals that the Persians would not disrupt. Tragedy and comedy would continue, though playwrights would be cautious about political themes. Historical plays like Aeschylus's The Persians, which celebrated Greek victory, obviously could not be performed. But mythological tragedies exploring timeless themes of fate, justice, and suffering would continue. In fact, the shift away from contemporary political events toward timeless myths might make Greek drama more universal, more accessible across cultures. Architecture would change dramatically. Greek temples, with their columned facades and triangular pediments, would still be built. But Persian architectural elements would be incorporated. The hypostyle hall, with its forest of columns supporting a flat roof, was a Persian innovation. Glazed brick reliefs, showing processions of animals or royal figures, decorated Persian palaces. These elements might appear in Greek buildings, creating a distinctive Greco-Persian architectural style. The Greeks in Asia Minor, living under Persian rule for generations, would pioneer this synthesis. But if mainland Greece fell to Persia, the style would spread there too. Imagine the Parthenon not as we know it, but as a hybrid building. Greek columns and proportions, but with Persian polychrome decoration, glazed brick panels, perhaps even the tall columned halls of Persepolis. The result would be alien to our eyes, but would have its own beauty and logic. In literature, the Greek language itself might change. Already in our timeline, Greek incorporated many Persian words through contact. Under direct Persian rule, this borrowing would accelerate. Administrative terms, luxury goods, architectural features, all these would enter Greek vocabulary. The language would become richer, more cosmopolitan, though purists might lament the loss of Attic purity. Greek literature might also incorporate Persian forms and themes. Persian poetry, with its elaborate metaphors and court style, was sophisticated though very different from Greek. A synthesis might produce something new, perhaps lyric poetry, that combined Greek metrical complexity with Persian metaphorical richness. Or historical writing might adopt the Persian style of royal annals, creating a hybrid form. The sciences might flourish under Persian rule. The Persians valued practical knowledge, astronomy for calendar keeping, mathematics for taxation and engineering, medicine for healing. Greek theoretical science, with its concern for underlying principles and mathematical description, could combine with Persian practical application. The result might be more rapid technological progress than in our timeline. Consider astronomy. The Babylonians under Persian rule maintained detailed astronomical records and could predict eclipses. Greek astronomers in our timeline eventually learned from these records and developed theoretical models to explain them. Under direct Persian rule, this synthesis might happen faster and more thoroughly. Aristarchus's heliocentric hypothesis, proposed in our timeline in the 3rd century BCE, might emerge earlier and gain more support. Medicine, similarly, could benefit from cross-cultural exchange. Greek medicine, based on the Hippocratic theories of humours and balance, was theoretical but lacked systematic anatomy. Persian medicine had access to Indian medical knowledge, which was in some ways more advanced. A synthesis of Greek theory, Persian practice, and Indian knowledge might advance medical science significantly. Yet we must acknowledge what would be lost. The particular genius of classical Greek culture emerged from political circumstances that combined freedom and insecurity, ambition and desperation. The Athenian Golden Age happened when Athens was rich from silver mines and imperial tribute, confident from military victories, but also anxious about Spartan rivalry and internal conflict. This combination produced extraordinary creative energy. Under stable Persian rule, Athens might be prosperous and peaceful, but that very stability could reduce creative urgency. The great tragedies, with their exploration of moral ambiguity and political dilemmas, emerge from a society grappling with empire and democracy. Take away those struggles, provide stable Persian governance, and the questions that drove Greek tragedy might not arise. The same applies to historical writing. Herodotus and Thucydides wrote not just to record events, but to understand them, to derive lessons for posterity. Herodotus wanted to understand how Greeks had defeated Persia. Thucydides wanted to understand how Athens had lost the Peloponnesian War. Both projects were driven by political crises. Without those crises, without independent Greek politics, historical writing might revert to the chronicle form common in earlier civilizations, recording events without analyzing them. The philosophical commitment to following arguments wherever they lead, even to uncomfortable conclusions, was connected to Greek political culture. In the assembly and law courts, bad arguments were exposed and punished. This created intellectual discipline, removed that political context, and philosophy might become more decorative, more concerned with demonstrating erudition than discovering truth. But perhaps this is too pessimistic. Human creativity is resilient, adapting to circumstances, finding expression even under constraint. Persian rule, for all its limits, was not totalitarian in any modern sense. There was room for intellectual and artistic achievement, as the Ionian Greeks demonstrated. A Greek culture that developed under Persian rule would be different from what we know, but it might be equally sophisticated, equally profound, in its own way. The question ultimately is whether the specific combination of freedom and insecurity that produced classical Greek culture was necessary, or whether similar achievements could emerge from different circumstances. We cannot know with certainty, but as we have explored this alternate history, we have seen how deeply political circumstances shape cultural achievement. The road not taken at Marathon and Salamis would have led to a different cultural landscape, one we can barely imagine from our vantage point in the timeline that actually happened. Let us now bring our journey to its conclusion, considering how this alternate past would shape the long future, reaching across millennia to touch the world of today. The long shadow, our world transformed. We have travelled far from the Straits of Salamis. We have watched Persian victory, observed Greek culture adapting to imperial rule, seen Rome develop under Eastern influence, traced butterflies across centuries. Now we must face the most vertiginous question. What would our world look like today if the Persians had conquered Greece 25 centuries ago? This is speculation upon speculation. Compound interest accrued over 2.5 millennia. Every generation would make choices that multiplied possibilities, creating a probability tree so complex that no single alternate timeline can be traced with confidence. But we can identify some major trajectories, some broad patterns that would differ from our history. The most fundamental difference would be in how we understand Western civilization itself. In our timeline, that term refers to a tradition traced from Greece to Rome, to medieval Christendom to the modern West. The narrative is one of ideas: Greek philosophy, Roman law, Christian ethics, Enlightenment reason. These supposedly shaped our political systems, our science, our values. Whether this narrative is accurate or mythologized, it is how we tell our story. In a world where Persia conquered Greece, that narrative collapses. There is no Greek miracle of freedom defeating despotism. There is no pure Western tradition distinct from Eastern influences. Instead, from the beginning, what we call Western civilization is a hybrid, a synthesis of Greek and Persian elements, of European and Asian influences. The very concept of West versus East would not exist in the same form. This would affect modern identity profoundly. European nationalism often defined itself against the East, against Islam, against the supposed despotism of Oriental empires. The myth of Western freedom originating in Greece and threatened by Eastern tyranny has justified everything from imperialism to racial theories. Remove that founding myth, and European identity would develop along entirely different lines. Perhaps Europe would see itself as the western edge of a great Eurasian cultural continuum, not as a separate civilization. The Roman Empire, in this timeline, might stretch from Britain to Mesopotamia, a truly Mediterranean empire that blurred the line between Europe and Asia, the cultural arrogance that later Europeans displayed toward. Non-Western peoples might be less pronounced if their own origin stories involved synthesis rather than Greek purity. The religious landscape would be utterly different. Christianity as we know it emerged from the intersection of Jewish messianism, Greek philosophy, and Roman imperial structure. Change any of these elements and Christianity changes, or perhaps never emerges. Judaism under long-term Persian rule would develop differently. In our timeline, Judaism developed its distinctive character partly in reaction to various conquerors: Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, Romans. The Hebrew Bible reached its final form during and after the Babylonian exile. Rabbinic Judaism developed after the Roman destruction of the Second Temple. Each political crisis shaped Jewish theology. Under continuous Persian rule, Judaism might maintain closer ties to Zoroastrian dualism. The concepts of Satan, heaven and hell, final judgment, bodily resurrection, all these entered Judaism during and after the Persian period. With prolonged Persian influence, these concepts might become even more central. Judaism might develop as a more explicit monotheistic partner to Zoroastrianism, both worshipping one supreme deity, both emphasizing moral choice and eschatological judgment. Christianity, if it emerged at all, would emerge from this different Judaism. Jesus' teaching, which in our timeline drew on both Jewish prophetic tradition and Greek philosophical concepts, would draw instead on a Judaism more influenced by Persian thought. The result would be a religion with different emphases, perhaps less focused on incarnation and more on ethical dualism, less concerned with Greek philosophical problems like the nature of the Trinity, and more focused on eschatological salvation. The spread of this alternate Christianity would follow different networks. Without the Hellenistic world of Greek-speaking cities, without the Roman roads and imperial postal system that Paul used, the new religion would spread more slowly through different communities. It might remain more localized, perhaps never becoming the dominant religion of Europe. Islam presents an even more complex case. Muhammad lived and preached in 7th century Arabia, claiming to restore the true monotheism of Abraham against what he saw as Christian and Jewish distortions. Islam was shaped by the Byzantine-Sasanian Wars, by Arab reactions to both empires, by the intellectual and theological disputes of late antiquity. In a timeline where Persia never fell to Alexander, where Rome developed under Persian influence, the entire political and cultural context of 7th century Near East would be different. The Sasanian Persian Empire might still exist, or might have been replaced by something else entirely. Arab identity might have developed differently. The specific circumstances that produced Muhammad and the early Islamic community might never occur. If Islam did emerge in something like its historical form, its spread and development would be affected by the different political landscape. The rapid Arab conquests of the 7th century succeeded partly because the Byzantine and Sasanian empires had exhausted each other in endless wars. In our alternate timeline, the political situation would be different, perhaps making such conquests impossible, or directing them into different territories. The medieval period would be fundamentally different. In our timeline, Western Europe emerged from the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, preserved some Roman and Greek learning through monasteries, slowly recovered economically and culturally, eventually experiencing the Renaissance and scientific revolution. This is a story of decline, preservation, and recovery, of classical learning lost and then rediscovered. In the alternate timeline, there might be no collapse, no dark ages, because the synthesis of Greek and Persian thought would continue uninterrupted in a stable empire. Or conversely, the alternative political arrangements might be less stable, leading to earlier and more complete collapse. The variables are too numerous for confident prediction. What we can say is that the specific intellectual tradition that produced modern science would be different. In our timeline, the scientific revolution combined Greek mathematical reasoning with empirical observation and experimental method. It happened in Western Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries, drawing on rediscovered Greek and Arab texts, responding to specific cultural and economic pressures. In an alternate timeline, scientific thinking might develop earlier or later, in different places, emphasizing different methods. Perhaps practical Persian engineering traditions would merge with Greek theoretical mathematics to produce an earlier scientific revolution. Or perhaps the stable Persian-influenced world would lack the economic and intellectual disruption that stimulated innovation in our timeline. Technology often drives history as much as ideas. The printing press, gunpowder, ocean-going ships, the steam engine, electricity, these inventions reshaped human society regardless of political systems. Many would probably be invented in any plausible timeline, though perhaps at different times and places. But technology is not entirely independent of culture. The printing press mattered because European society valued literacy and multiple copies of texts. A society with different values might not exploit the same invention in the same way. The political structures of the modern world would certainly be different. The concept of the nation-state, which dominates modern politics, has specific historical origins in post-medieval Europe. It arose from the breakup of universal claims to authority, from the Protestant Reformation's challenge to unified Christendom, from the economic changes that made territorial states more viable than feudal arrangements. In a world where a Persian-influenced universal empire maintained itself longer, the nation-state might never become the dominant form, or it might emerge later from different causes. Alternative forms like multi-ethnic empire, city-state networks, or religious community organization might persist as legitimate political structures. Democracy, which we trace to Athens and value as self-evident good, would have different status. The Athenian experiment in our alternate timeline was curtailed by Persian conquest. The idea that citizens should govern themselves directly might survive in political theory but lack the prestige of historical success. Conversely, the Persian model of tolerant empire with local autonomy might seem more attractive, especially to multi-ethnic societies. The Enlightenment, that 18th century movement that championed reason, individual rights and democratic governance, was deeply influenced by idealized views of ancient Greece and Rome. Thinkers like Rousseau and Jefferson looked back to Athens and the Roman Republic as models. Without those models, or with different understandings of them, Enlightenment thought would develop differently. Modern concepts of human rights, individual freedom, and democratic legitimacy might emerge eventually, because they respond to real human needs and aspirations, but they would be justified through different historical examples and philosophical arguments. The specific form of liberal democracy that emerged in the West might be replaced by alternative systems that balanced individual and collective needs differently. The Industrial Revolution and modern capitalism might still occur, driven by technological possibilities and economic logic, but the cultural framework around them would differ. The Protestant work ethic, which some scholars argue was crucial to capitalism's development, would not exist in the same form. Different religious and philosophical traditions would shape how people understood wealth, labor and progress, colonialism and imperialism. Those dark chapters of recent history might play out differently, but probably would still happen. The drive to conquer, exploit and dominate seems unfortunately universal across cultures. A world where Persian-style empire was the historical norm might see different justifications for conquest. Less pretense of bringing civilization to savages, perhaps more honest about imperial exploitation. The two world wars of the 20th century were caused by specific circumstances: European nationalism, imperial rivalries, economic pressures, particular alliance systems. In an alternate timeline 2.5 millennia diverged, none of these specific causes would exist. But human capacity for large-scale violence would remain. Different wars, arising from different causes, might be equally devastating. The question of whether humanity would be better off in this alternate timeline is unanswerable. Different does not mean better or worse in any absolute sense. Some things we value might not exist. Perhaps no Shakespeare, no Beethoven, no Declaration of Independence. But other achievements, impossible to imagine from our timeline, would take their place. Different philosophers would ask different questions. Different artists would create different beauty. Different political movements would pursue different visions of justice. What we can say with confidence is that the world would be unrecognizable to us. Language, religion, politics, culture, all would be fundamentally different. Even physical landscapes would differ as different cities became important, different buildings were constructed, different patterns of agriculture and settlement emerged. Consider something as mundane as the calendar. We use a calendar system with months named after Roman emperors and gods, a 7-day week inherited from Judaism and Christianity, a dating system counting years from the supposed birth of Christ. In the alternate timeline, different calendars would dominate, perhaps derived from Persian or Zoroastrian systems. The way we mark time, organize our weeks, celebrate holidays, all would be alien, or consider language. English, which I am using to write this, is a Germanic language heavily influenced by Latin and Greek. In an alternate timeline, the language spoken in Britain might be entirely different, perhaps more influenced by Celtic roots, or by continental languages that themselves developed under different influences. The very words we use to think and communicate would be different, shaping thought in ways we cannot imagine from within our linguistic framework. The point of this exercise in alternate history is not to claim that Persian victory would have been better or worse for humanity. It is to highlight how contingent our world is, how much depends on specific events that could have turned out differently. The battles of Marathon and Salamis genuinely were pivot points in history. Had they ended differently, based on everything we understand about Persian governance and cultural patterns, the resulting world would have developed along radically different trajectories. This should inspire both humility and wonder. Humility because the civilization we sometimes regard as inevitable, as the natural culmination of human progress, is actually the result of countless accidents and contingencies. Wonder because despite all that contingency, humans in any timeline create meaning, beauty, and knowledge. We are remarkably adaptable, capable of profound achievement under vastly different circumstances. As we conclude this long journey through an alternate past, let us return to where we began. The cliffs of Thermopylae, the straits of Salamis, the desperate days when everything hung in balance. Those ancient Greeks who fought the Persians could not have imagined our world. They fought for their immediate freedom, their cities, their ways of life. They could not know that their victories would echo through millennia, shaping civilizations they could not conceive. And yet they fought, and they won, and here we are, products of their improbable triumph. The story we tell ourselves about Western civilization begins with those battles. It is a powerful story, inspiring and dangerous, true in some ways and false in others. The alternate history we have explored reminds us that other stories were possible. The Persians were not monsters, but empire builders, sophisticated and tolerant in their way. A world where they had won would not have been dark age but different age, with its own achievements and failures. History is not destiny. The past was not inevitable. Every moment contains multiple futures, forking paths leading to different destinations. We live in one such path, shaped by choices made in sunshine and blood 2,500 years ago. And as we face our own uncertain future, perhaps we can draw wisdom from this, that human dignity and achievement do not depend on any single political system or cultural tradition. They emerge from the human capacity for reason, creativity, and compassion, which persist across all timelines, all histories, all possible worlds. The desert wind blows across Thermopylae. The waves lap at Salamis. The stones remember what we can only imagine. And in that imagination, in the asking of what if, we find not just entertainment, but insight into how our world came to be, and how precarious and precious it truly is. If this journey through history's shadows has intrigued you, if the contemplation of roads not taken has stirred your imagination, consider subscribing for more explorations of the past's mysteries and possibilities. And tell me, where are you, listening from tonight, and what alternate history would you like to explore next? Until we meet again in the quiet hours between sleep and waking, may your rest be peaceful and your dreams be vivid with all the worlds that might have been.